All right, we're going to run the video. Go ahead and run the video.
Environmental, social, and governance topics have historically been on the C-suite agenda, but it's really only been in the recent years with the evolution and expansion of ESG scope that is now materially influencing the way companies structure themselves, conduct business, and serve their customers. CDOs are now challenged with how they harness the power of their data assets and analytics to advance their organizations and drive meaningful, sustainable, and measurable growth and value. Join our KPMG global ESG and data analytics leadership as we explore those challenges and opportunities faced by our CDOs.
That building is awesome. Hello and welcome to track 1, environmental, social, and governance, better data insights enabling companies' ESG goals and ultimate benefit society. I'm your track producer, Robert Lutton, Vice President of Untitled Consultants, and I'd like to welcome you to ESG and the CDO, creating a path to value. I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. Presentations will be included in the symposium proceedings, included in your registration at no additional charge. These recordings will be uploaded to the CDOIQ YouTube channel 3 months after the symposium. There will be a Q&A session, so for our audience online, please use your Q&A feature on the Whova app, and we'll be monitoring for that. So today, I've got the great pleasure of introducing folks live here who are wonderful to speak to from our folks at KPMG. So I'd like to introduce Danielle, Martin, and Sreekar, who will be each doing a quick opening bio on themselves as well. So Danielle.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning. I'm Danielle Beringer. I lead our KPMG Modern Data Platform and our data engineering practice in Lighthouse. I'm really excited to be here today, and I hope that you'll definitely glean from this experience. I'd like to bring some of my past experience as the Chief Data Officer for Nissan to our conversation.
Also, good morning. My name is Martin Kaestner. I lead the data analytics and AI practice within KPMG in the US. So I focus on the use of cognitive automation, the use of AI, and really how we serve our clients to adopt these kind of technologies, but also how our clients can leverage these types of technologies together with the data to drive efficiencies, to be more data-driven, and kind of move the needle in their journey.
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sreekar Krishna. I'm one of the partners at KPMG, and I lead our AI strategy, and I'm the national leader for AI at KPMG. Primarily, I've been working with Danielle, Martin, and one of our colleagues, Bob, who couldn't be here, primarily driving the CDO's agenda around how do we think about the life cycle of data and AI as it comes to ESG. So we'll talk today about some of the things we are hearing in the market, some of the new evolving concepts around AI and ESG, which is a very passionate area for me. I would love to see if there are questions and have a healthy discussion today.
So let's get started. We have about 40 minutes of prepared material, and we'd like to leave 20 minutes for questions and answers. I hope you'll be energized by the conversation and hopefully learn something new. When we look at the structure for the value pathway for a chief data officer, we often use this framework. Now, today we'll use an ESG lens, but I want to go through some of the key activities with an emphasis on how a chief data officer can achieve value by being the bridge between business areas and technology groups. The value to the organization first starts with a data-driven community, and many people are in various stages of maturity around data literacy and building a data culture. We know that people have a great emphasis after GDPR, CCPA, and unfortunately some fail AI experimentation when they really looked at data quality. So the context for data is extremely important. And today we're going to build on that story and talk about why it's essential for ESG initiatives. Speed and cost and automation and efficiency for knowledge workers is also a key dimension of a chief data officer's focus. Whether people are wrangling through thousands of records in Excel, whether they are consuming data from a certified data catalog, or whether there are opportunities for RPA and automation for training machine learning models, data pipelines, maybe they're getting into data ops and ML ops. All of those things are within the reach of the Chief Data Officer in being the bridge between the business and ITIS. The third area is enabling decision and action. Insight generation can be very varied, particularly when business stakeholders can't agree on KPIs and data context. So there is an essential understanding of data literacy, data lineage, and data governance. We believe that data quality is having a renaissance. Groups that are coming out of significant investment in remediation for GDPR, CCPA, and privacy actions to protect customer data really opened the aperture for investment of time and resources to take better care of customer data, as well as other data domains that are connected to it and often blended with it for business initiatives. The fourth category is identifying new sources of value. Many CDOs struggle with having to prove the value of the investment in data catalogs, data preparation. Data observability is an emergent field which is very exciting for people who are finally getting their data pipelines and their data curation to be bulletproof and sustainable. And there's a new category that we like to say is data-driven momentum, and that's the intersection point for ESG. So if any chief data officers have used GDPR and CCPA or data science projects that don't have enough data accessibility for knowledge workers, ESG opens the door to another conversation. So we're really moving from data awareness in some of those early initiatives as people were beginning to form maybe a data and analytics COE, a chief data office that also was partnering with a CISO, CTO, or CIO, but identifying centers of excellence in the lines of business with data and analytics leaders. Let's use ESG and the extension of the types of data that we need for successful sustainability reporting and have that as a new conversation to really get more momentum around those metrics, increasing data awareness across an organization. We did a study earlier this year of a poll for over 300 organizations in 14 sectors. Our goal was to identify who are the leaders and what is their commitment to ESG reporting and preparation in their roadmaps. We found some surprising information, and that was really around a very low uptake of the chief data officer being in a position of influence or involvement in the ESG programs. 92% of S&P 500 companies are publishing CSR material, but the chief data officer is not necessarily in the room. And so we know that this is a key turning point where the chief data officer can position all of the past discipline and rigor around data products, data lineage, data quality, and bring that to the key data assets that are necessary for that reporting. 37% of everyone polled in our survey said that not having the data to measure ESG performance was the biggest challenge facing their program. So if data accessibility was an issue before, with running the business, with having an operational model that supports working with stakeholders, working with those that are engaged in an organization, imagine how much more difficult it will be with this new dimension of data that often is not well understood. And Sreekar is going to talk a little bit about what some of those data dimensions are. What are the features, what are the attributes that are essential for this type of reporting? Data does make a difference. And so today we'll talk about the value and the regulation of how your existing data ecosystem with a chief data officer that has partners and advocates for data can come together around the ESG conversation. It's certainly a quality conversation around accuracy, completeness, conformity, consistency, all the things that the chief data officer is already doing. And so we're suggesting that that's a key person to be leading this effort. Again, 8% of program leaders today for sustainability ESG reporting are chief data officers. That number is far too low. When you look at some of the spikes, we see directors, risk executives. We do have ESG appointed sustainability officers, and that's emergent, that's fantastic, and chief financial officers. So if those individuals remain the leads of these efforts, it is a great opportunity for the chief data officer to work in partnership with those individuals to ensure that they have full visibility to the range of data services and new opportunities to use that data in an effective way. I always like to say that the Chief Data Officer is like the Kevin Bacon of data. So any of you that know about the Kevin Bacon game, it's 5 degrees of separation. The Chief Data Officer can be that bridge. They can be the person that is seen as the holder of the catalog, as the one who unlocks the context for the data. There's also an important awareness for blind spots. So if the mission of the Chief Data Officer is to bring those people together, to take the practice, the framework of data that's in an organization, regardless of the maturity that it is in a data maturity spectrum, they also have to uncover blind spots. The use of third-party data is absolutely essential for ESG and sustainability reporting. So one of the things that we'll talk further about, and Martin's going to go into this subject, is how do third-party data and data and analytics in an organization allow a group to achieve what they need to for ESG, as well as inform the rest of the organization who today may only be tangential to those conversations, but will be essential to validating the metrics, KPIs, and the data itself, the data products that will have to be part of future ESG reporting cycles. So I'll pass it over to Martin.
Thanks, Danielle. So I'm going to focus on a couple of topics. So one, how ESG really is the responsibility or already encompasses the responsibilities of a CDO. I'm going to talk a little bit about third-party data and how third-party data can enrich and evolve the program of ESG and the CDO's role, and then also the role of advanced analytics, how that's going to play into the CDO's role and ESG as well. So we, like Danielle was saying, we did a survey, and if we just look at the top 6 key success factors for an ESG program, it really reads like the responsibilities of a CDO today. So collecting cross-functional data, translating data into financial value, consolidating data, maintaining data accuracy and hygiene, understanding reporting requirements, and understanding ESG, what the data needs are. So if you think about it, and as Danielle was pointing out, a lot of CDOs today are not involved in some of the ESG programs, or only tangential. This is probably going to change. So everything around ESG is going to be data-driven. So all these key success factors are really what the CDO is focused on. So I see it almost like a mini project for the CDO, where they normally take care of the enterprise data. ESG is going to be a very special topic that the CDOs has to get involved into. And then the question is there going to be a sub-department that will just focus on ESG data, for example, and talk about the requirements, talk about the data collections, talk about the curation of data and all of that. So ESG is going to be much more important, or the role of the CDO is going to be much more important as part of ESG. The importance of ESG, and we see it with activist investors, is going to be as part of budgets, as part of investments, as part of valuations. And of course, companies are taking notice. And as you can see, between 2020 and 25, the spending on ESG is more than doubling. So there's probably a lot of money that's available. With that also comes a lot of responsibilities or expectations on what a company is going to present or going to provide to the investors community, to the stakeholders. So it's no longer just what are you going to do for diversity, equity, integrity. What are you going to for health and safety? All the topics of ESG, but it's probably also going to look at how do you compare to your peers? How do you compare to your geographic location? And that's going to require third-party data. So there's lots of data out there that might not be your typical ESG data, but can influence and can enrich the type of analysis or the types of insights that you can provide. And I have a couple of examples on the next slide here for analytics. But in general, I think the CDO's role is going to, again, expand and is going to have larger budgets, and the expectations are going to rise. If we look at some of the focus areas, and this is also part of our survey, there's a lot of areas in here which probably are also going to evolve from just simple reporting to more and more advanced analytics. If we just take a couple of examples here. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, it's probably not enough that you just report on what your diversity looks like or where you came from and what the progress is. But you might actually have to do some projections. You might have to do some options analysis. So we worked with a client where we actually helped them to find locations for data centers. And they had, as part of their DEI program, the goal of increasing diversity and also to help people who were maybe underprivileged, undereducated to find work. So, and identifying, again, third party, where these types of workforce exists, what the locations offer, and then do an options analysis, do some projections. This might also require some projections about movement of people, workforce development, the trends and those kind of things. So those can, be very helpful in terms of providing options and analysis, but also to then quantify what the results potentially should look like using advanced analytics. Another example is, for example, health and safety. So a lot of health and safety is really not new, but it's part of the ESG program, of course, as well, where traditionally, especially in the energy sector, industrial manufacturing, you had to report to OSHA, you had to report incidents and how many days without incidents and all these statistics. But what's really turning the page is, again, the data that you have, historical data, but third-party data as well, and how that can impact your health and safety of your workplace, of certain locations. So we helped an energy company where they were looking at their incidents and safety issues, and they correlated that data with weather data, for example, but then also looking at how much experience their subcontractors brought in, what the combination, the team size were, or if the deadlines of projects were influencing the safety records and all of that. So as you can see, there's a lot of data that you might have as a company, but also that might be coming from the outside. It could be weather data, it could be statistics, it could be coming from open source data or also data that's from prescriptions, and then using that data to learn from the past and then project it into the future. So the role of advanced analytics is going to be very critical in terms of not just reporting and where you are currently as a status, but also where you're going to go and potentially what decisions, so like the predictions or the prescriptive options that you might have. So far we have been looking at kind of the role of the CDO and what their role and responsibilities will be as part of the ESG, the role of third-party data analytics, but at the same time, ESG is also going to have an impact on the role of the CDO itself, and that's what Sreekar is going to talk about.
Thank you, Martin. And as Danielle and Martin were explaining, what we have been hearing from CDOs is what we think is just the start of this wave, the second wave that's happening within the CDO world. And that's starting with ESG, right? I mean, a lot of questions are being asked around what data are you going to consume? How are you going to report with the data that you're consuming? But the big question that we have to ask ourselves is, the CDO is not just the consumer of the data, but they're also producers of the data that will go downstream. So if you are an institution that is going to be responsible for producing certain data sets that are going to be consumed downstream by other institutions, what ESG initiatives are you taking in order to address that data? So the question really goes down to, do you have a strategy for green data for your own institution? And I want to say green data is a word that has been used today in the industry already, but I think there is a opportunity for the CDOs to expand the definition of green data and really encompass the opportunities that CDOs can offer to their company, but also to other institutions that use your institution as a third party. So if I take the industry definition of green data today, it's a very narrow definition. The industry is asking how much of my data is being stored in a green data center, and they're calling that as green data. And this goes back to all those conversations we were having a few years back where data centers were consuming tremendous amounts of power. The power was coming from coal. And there was a natural inclination to say, you know what, per terabyte of data that I produce or I store, I want to make it more green from a green data center perspective. But this is a narrower definition of where we could be heading with our data as we give it to downstream folks who are consuming it from us, whether it be it our own corporations or be it third-party corporations. The broader definition of green data should incorporate our own measures of environmental, social, and governance policies that the institution has and that we apply to our data, so the consumption of the data still remains green. Take, for example, any analytics that Martin talked about or any of the AI models that your institution will want to build. How do you make sure you're encompassing that green definition to those AI models? So what are you going to do to make sure that your models are responsible? What are you going to make sure to ensure that when the customer asks you to delete the data, you are indeed deleting the data and you're reporting it back through your ESG channel, so we can say the data that is coming out of this institution is indeed green. So maintaining that greenness of the data through its life cycle. So which brings me back to cradle to grave of the data. And I know this is a concept that is very popular in our everyday world where we talk about a bottle of water, where we ask where did this plastic come from, who made this plastic, how is it going to get recycled, how is it going to, will it end up in the landfill? That's the cradle to grave that we have already been asking from an ESG perspective from product companies. But if we are institutions that are producing data that we consume or if we give out to third parties, we definitely have to think about cradle to grave of the data and ask all of these lifecycle questions. Where did the data originate? Was it a third-party data that I bought and I did something to it? Now, how do I track it? How do I make sure if the third party says, hey, that data is not clean anymore, it's dark data, I have an ability to respond to it as the CDO of the institution to reach out to the downstream and say, hey, we have a challenge here, we need to change the data set. Or vice versa, you are a corporation, you are using your employees' data to produce certain models, let's say in HR analytics, and you are using it for new hires or whatever. The employee now is no longer with the institution and makes a request that their personal data be deleted from your HR records. How are you going to respond to it? How is the model that is using the data of that employee who no longer works in the institution, are you going to change the model? These are some of the important questions we have to ask around the life cycle of the data as we think about the greenness of it. We have to have ability, and this is truly a CDO responsibility. If I'm the chief data officer of an institution, we need to have a strategy to say, how do I map the cradle to grave of the data as it progresses through the different parts of our organization? I know it's a very demanding question. We still are trying to figure out how to connect all the data lineages and see how it is going to end up in the hands of the business. But from an ESG perspective, if I'm going to give that data out to somebody, if I'm the third party for somebody, or if a regulator comes tomorrow and says, hey, how green is your data, we need to think about the cradle to grave of the data that is going through our institution. Yeah, I mean, we all have responded to CCPA, GDPR in some fashion or form. There's always a hope that all the 50 states come together and we have a federal mandate on data governance. However fast it may or may not happen, we will always struggle with different countries having different reporting structures, different needs. So I don't think we are going to go into a place where we will have a seamless one-size-fits-all for our data privacy and the demands from the customers, or even our own corporate demands, our employees, our third-party vendors, our contractors. They are going to put demand on us from privacy perspective. So when you think about your data, how are you going to respond to the right to forget? We are already starting to see this, right? We have to establish data operations teams where a demand comes for removal of data from a customer, and people are scrambling to find where that customer's data is residing. CCPA requires 45-day notice period and another 45 days before reacting to the request. But that's going to be different in different countries. And if you especially operate in international territories, you will have to comply with a lot of different ideologies. So the best way to think about this is to say, can I containerize my data in its life cycle in a way that if tomorrow the request comes from a specific institution, you have at least the mechanism to react to that request. And it doesn't turn out that that request is going to be in firefight. And we have seen that already happen. Some of our financial service institutions, they are struggling to handle all of this data rights requirements that are coming through. They are establishing like 200, 300 people team offshore to react to requests. And this is becoming a compliance nightmare. And everything is a fist fight. It is not an organized battle. And that is exactly what is required from the perspective of thinking of the right to forget that customers are going to ask. And I'll quickly cover what impact this has for AI models, because the right to forget on the data has downstream impact. If you are third party for somebody else, how are you going to report out to the third party who is using your data that, hey, I have a change in my data and I need you to adopt that? We have some structures in the financial service industry today where consumers of data are told that there is a change in the data, or there's a version change in the data, or a correction in the data. But those are very small, minuscule changes compared to big changes that will come when right to forget is imposed upon the community. So ESG is not only for the third parties, right? It is also for our own institution. So when we think about data and what's happening with the data, there's a lot of questions that we need to ask ourselves. How do we respond to a lot of these ethical, social, governance questions that are coming through the pipeline? I mean, you already know all the big tech is hiring AI responsibility engineers. It's a new phrase, right? These engineers who are trained in AI are sitting and monitoring these AI models and asking that ethical, responsible questions. We don't even know what their qualifications are. Should they be the ones asking those questions? Those structures are coming into place now for us to respond to what's happening in the market, right? And these institutions that are ahead on this regulatory side are responding almost without a strategy. They're just responding with people. But today, we have to ask ourselves, what are all the different things that can throw this thing off our strategies, right? I mean, if you think about data handling processes today, we don't have a good chartered way of saying, here is how the data was handled from cradle to grave. This is why we think our data is green. Or this is how we managed our processes, our governance program. How do I report it out through metrics? So when somebody consumes my data within the company or outside the company, they get a report card which says my data follows these standards for greenness, and we are reporting it back on that. Think about reasoning using your data. I mean, the reason we all buy into data is so we can make decisions, right? We send the data up to the executives, and the executives make decisions. How do you ensure that the decision that you made was not done on some arbitrary data that nobody had put their eyes on? Nobody has the time, the decision makers especially don't have the time to ask all these questions down to which third-party data did we use in order to make a decision to not go into a specific market or pull out of a market, even worse. If we did use certain third-party data, how green was that data? Did we have any kind of knowledge about where that data was generated, how it was generated, how was it used in the decisioning process? That's a big question that we are all asking, and there is no easy answer for this. And the CDOs have I would say a responsibility, but it's an opportunity basically, to say that we could respond to these questions that might come from within the four walls of our institution or from the outside. AI ops, ML ops, Danielle covered a little bit of it. It's going to be a huge game changer for institutions that adopt the data policies and the AI policies early on in the pipeline. Another big one that we are seeing is the threat to your AI models because of data poisoning. So everybody knows today that there is some kind of an AI model that is sitting in the decisioning pipeline of our institutions, whether it be customer-facing or be it internal employee-facing. What happens if there is an insider attack or if there is an external threat which poisons the data and your AI model is now corrupted? I mean, as a recovering data scientist myself, I'll tell you, no model is perfect. And there is the adage, the garbage in, garbage out. So if my data that I'd used for training my AI models had a certain behavior, and suddenly the data has been poisoned just because of an insider attack, or it could be just that nobody was paying attention to the quality of the data. Now the AI model's output is not valid. Any data scientist will tell you that. They'll say this is not IID, which means it was not taken from the same source from where we trained the model. So the output of that model is at that point undesirable. How do we protect for that? We are not protecting for it for sure. I mean, institutions are not paying attention to, they look at data deviation, they look at model deviation, but you can corrupt the model's output if the data changes. How do we protect for it? How do we report it? So that I can tell downstream, hey, I have put all the guardrails around these data and the AI models, so you can be rest assured when I give you my scores, you will see that the data is clean and it is going through a green pipeline that we are producing. I spoke of responsibility engineers. The question is going to come, what operating model are we establishing within our four walls to respond to responsible AI, ethical AI, green data, ESG principles within the institution? What is that operating model? I think that's a big question. We still don't have a good operating model for the CDO's daily job, but the ESG expectations are higher. And how do we respond to it from a true teaming perspective is going to be important for that. There you go. Yeah. So I'll just jump into explainability a little bit more, right? So responsible AI and explainable AI is being interchangeably used in the market today. A lot of people will say, if you have explainability, you can respond to the responsibility of the AI model. So if I can explain what's happening in the AI model, what features it is using, what data it is using, then I may be able to say, hey, I am responsible because I am not letting a black box algorithm go to town and take the decisions. I really know what is happening. But I'll argue that explainability is one aspect of the responsibility, but responsibility requires a lot more attention that is beyond the act of a data scientist or a data analyst in the room. We need to have all the stakeholders in the room, legal, social, the responsibility metrics that the institution has adopted. Who is going to marry all of these things into the data and the AI pipeline? I think the CDOs have a responsibility here to raise their hand and say, we will own the inputs to all of the models or the AI capabilities so we can respond to both the responsible as well as the ethical AI conversations that are going on. And I put some considerations over here. They are very broad, but these considerations have come about because we have seen a lot of institutions get into a lot of different regulatory issues or explaining themselves to FTC and to the Senate why something happened or why something did not happen. And eventually, I think the ESG conversation, when it originally started, when we were talking about recycling things and reducing our carbon footprint on the earth, to where we are today, where it is becoming very tactical and we are all asking, oh, where will I get my LEED certification data, where I'll get my carbon footprint data? We are becoming too tactical and narrowly focused on the execution perspectives, but I think if you take a step back, the responsibility is a very important piece. And it cannot be done through third-party data sets. We can't. We have to take responsible AI a step behind and really ask a lot of fundamental questions within the institution in order to respond for responsible AI perspectives. And there is a big push now within the AI community to talk about simplified AI. Right? So we have gone too far with deep learning and all these other technologies, which are awesome. I mean, I love it as a data scientist, but there is a lot of black box approach to the data. You throw millions and trillions of bytes of data at it, and then you get certain models as an output. But those models can be useful for certain purposes, maybe like a driverless car. But if you say that every approach I take will involve a deep learning model, computer vision is very real. I mean, computer vision is coming. I mean, it is as foundational today as the large language models that have come out with BERT and GPT-3 and whatnot. So we are going to see a lot of these black box algorithms that will be taking decisions. But how do you simplify it? Do you always need a very complex algorithm to make decisions? Absolutely not. We are starting to ask that question in the data science community. How do we replace a black box algorithm with a simplified algorithm that can get to, let's say, 90% of the performance of the black box algorithm? At that point, you are taking strides towards responsible AI, because you are saying, I will sacrifice a few percentage points of success that this black box algorithm gives me versus this algorithm, which is explainable and it is easy for me to consume. We are still building all those tools in the industry to try to marry all of these concepts, but there is a big push to say, let's not complicate the algorithms just because we can, which seems to be the trend that has been set up, especially because we have all the cloud compute available and we can just train bigger and bigger models. But how do you take a step back and you ask for the simplification of the process? So these are some of the important considerations that come to be from an explainable AI perspective. But to extend it further, right, you have to think about the lifespan of the AI model. Just like the way we thought about the lifespan of the data model, we have to think about the lifespan of the AI model. When are you going to say, I am going to retrain the model? Today, the practice is, oh, the data deviates, I'm going to retrain the model. Oh, I didn't like the output from the AI model, I'm going to retrain the AI model. But those are not the correct lifecycle questions we need to ask for the AI model. We need to be asking ourselves, what's happening to the data that is coming through? Are we taking responsible actions through those AI models? If any one of those questions changes, then you have to retrain your AI model. You have to really think about the behavior of the AI model. I'll give a simple example, right? Personalization, you guys are all familiar with it. Google does it, Netflix does it, Amazon does it. If you use AI models that are personalized, and I'll give an example. One of my clients, they're an investment management firm, multi-trillion-dollar asset manager. They work with high net worth individuals, and they use personalization AI models that personalize the funds, that personalize the wholesaler who will go meet with with the client. They use a lot of AI models to make the decisions of how they are going to engage with their customers. What happens tomorrow if one of the customers says, I want you to forget my data. I don't want you holding on to any of my data. That entire personalization engine today will fall apart because it is based on that customer's data. How do you respond to that? What is your AI response when the client says, I want you to forget the data? So we have been, Danielle introduced herself with the title of Lead for Modern Data Platform. It is one of our flagships that we are working on, which actually thinks about creating synthetic data around customer data sets. So you can actually respond to the customer by saying, I can delete your data. But the synthetic data will take the place of the customer's data. And we have to make sure there is enough metrics and measures put in to make sure nobody can re-identify the customer from the synthetic data. So there's a lot of synthetic data initiatives that will come to be so you can protect your AI models from facing all of these difficulties that are coming into the pipeline. And with that, we're right at the 20-minute mark to the top of the hour. We'll open up for questions. I know we talked about a lot of different concepts. Would love to see if there are any questions here or online, and happy to respond.
Yeah, and one other comment before we get into questions. There's also a kind of a consumption, revisiting of consumption that's really important with cloud modernization. It is the prime opportunity as your organizations are looking at what you're moving to the cloud to really revisit the adoption of data products in an organization. We do not recommend dragging the anchor of a data product that only 2 people are using, right, into the future. So there's a data minimization exercise and really rigor around challenging the consumption of data in your organization, not just from an ESG perspective, but holistically. And it's a great time to do it. You're reducing your costs, you're reducing your storage and compute, and it's preparing you to have a little bit more manageable catalog of high-value data products in your organization that could be used for machine learning, that could be used for high value. The use of synthetic data and privacy-enhancing technologies also reduces the dependency on voluminous proliferation of customer data and data that really should not be replicated to the cloud. So we would also challenge that be part of your, an ongoing data discovery process that is forever. It's like having a pet. You can't just get the pet and buy the food. It's forever. So, get your organizations behind that. As the Chief Data Officer, you can be the soundpiece for that. And it starts to alleviate some of the overwhelm I think that business areas feel when they look at all of this data and really skinnying that down to the essentials as you're doing those, maybe you're moving your data warehouse to Snowflake or Databricks or, any one of the cloud service providers. That's a great time to have that conversation as well. So we'll take questions from the audience.
There's one question here. Yeah.
Yeah, hello. My name is Kelly Deerwester. I'm from Old National Bank. Thank you for the discussion. Interested in the recent policy the SEC put in place around public companies needing to file their customers' carbon footprint as we would make lending decisions on assets back out to them, and if you've got any insight into that.
I can respond to that. Thanks for bringing that up. This is just the start of it, right? I think we are going to see a lot more of these things come through the pipeline. The real struggle that we are having is there is no clean data that is giving us all of this information. We are kind of leaning in on third parties who are self-reporting some of these things. Some of the data is accumulated by, through surveys. And just think about your own organization, right? If somebody called me and they asked me, how green is KPMG's data? I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know because we have to, it's an initiative we have started within our own 4 walls to ask those questions. But do we have an answer for the external to consume the data that I have to produce, where I can tell them not only here is my answer today, but this is how I'm going to continue to maintain to give you that answer? It's a big challenge. And I think where the regulators are going is they are asking for us to show a plan. I think they are also familiar with the fact that this is all new and it's emerging right now, but I think they're asking us for a plan. At least in the few conversations I've had, we are in that early stage of producing the blueprint for how we are going to continue to do it. And possibly this is going to be the start of it. There's going to be a lot more that will come through. And as we go through changes in the administration, it may go back and forth. So we have to be prepared for that, if not react to it immediately. I don't think there's an immediate reaction. At least that's the sense I'm getting when I'm working with my financial services clients especially.
And I think there's going to absolutely be the emergence of a taxonomy that allows those within an industry to converse, right? So I was in the automotive industry for 8 years. We regularly met with other automotive OEMs to say, are we using the same metrics and KPIs around safety, around production, around quality? So that taxonomy could be common for NHTSA reporting and safety, et cetera. So I think each industry, there will be the emergence of ESG-focused taxonomy so that there is consistency around it. And I'm sure the regulatory bodies would want that as well.
And I'll make one quick comment on top of that. So I think we talked about third-party data, but I think as we're getting into your suppliers or your customers' data, there's also the data that you will have to leverage and potentially report on and rely on. but how do you actually get comfortable that you're using the data, that the data is correct? So I'm sure, like today for outsourcing, we use like SOC 2 reports and something like that. I'm expecting that some kind of regulation will emerge that because you cannot be held accountable for data that you don't control. So I'm assuming that more will be coming, and I'm not a big fan of regulations, but I'm sure that will enable some of those reporting as well.
Thank you for the presentation and also the motivation. My name is Christina Lichtner. I'm from University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and we're working with a lot of European companies on regulations and ESG, what it means also in terms of data management. And I share everything that you have been saying, but I was somehow missing one point that we are discussing, and that is how actually do you move from an intent or a vision, what you would actually like to report, into the real data that you find in your databases. And there's a step to make to translate a lot of things that have not been captured so far, or even if you have perhaps captured information about, I don't know, recycled material, not necessarily in a very consistent way. So what we are discussing very much with these companies is how can we actually come from something that is stated as regulation or kind of a general intent of the organization to something that is a data model and a semantic definition of what we should actually report. And this step, in my point of view, is very crucial, because if we don't get it right, and if we have global supply chains that have to report on emissions, for instance, or carbon footprint, so it's really hard to actually imagine that. So I somehow am missing a little bit this, or that could be also a topic for this community, to actually work on these more standardized way of thinking on taxonomies that you just mentioned. So I would just be curious to hear whether you see any of these, or how you actually would also consult your customers to approach that, and if you see any industry level or I don't know, expert level discussions around that.
Yeah, I mean, metadata is everything, right? So tagging and the tagging and labeling behaviors that are already being done in organization for domain data, sales data, customer data. Hopefully, if you're advancing in data literacy and context in your organization, you're doing tagging and labeling and have a catalog. I think there's a huge opportunity for business stakeholders to, first of all, be educated on what are the ESG metrics. Like if they don't know what a metric is, they won't even have the data attributes to be able to calculate it. And I think there could be some interesting metadata labeling done to say, I believe this is something we would use for ESG. And I think that oversight for that metadata collection is another layer in your data products catalog. But the rigor around that has to happen.
That I mean, the data is just not there. I mean, you basically have to enter into new data collection, or I don't know, relabeling.
The blind spots, right? So, and identifying where those blind spots are and having a path to acquire that data at the necessary level of grain.
Yeah, actually, I was just going to respond to that. That's a very good question that you brought up. And if you see, there is a precedence in the industry, especially in the cyber domain. In the cyber arena, where the CISOs have been in that compliance function for like 10 plus years now, and now slowly they are changing into a business unit by themselves. In the cyber domain, we as in the industry have spent a lot of time thinking about the reporting structure. In US, like there's the NIST framework, which has been put together to think about how do you protect, how do you defend, how do you respond, how do you react. So there's a lot of that precedence there just outside of the ESG domain. I mean, we can look at some of these areas that have been hot for like the last 20 years, where we have put some of these things into place. So when I talk to some of our clients and talk about ESG programs, there's a lot of leverage they can get if they look at their cyber program. And the way the cyber has been reporting into the CEO, the CIO, it's a very interesting platform that opens up opportunities, both from what Danielle was saying. They don't even know what metrics to create on ESG side. You come to the cyber side, they were in that boat like 20 years back. And they have over time created like, close to like 200 now standard metrics that are out there. Do we still get the data for that? Absolutely not. I mean, we're not able to satisfy the data for those metrics, but there are certain industry opportunities that can be opened up through the same lens that you're talking about.
I think it also speaks to one of the key focus areas was understanding your reporting requirements. So if you understand what you have to report on, or what maybe you have to, or maybe what you want to internally want to look at, that might drive some of the requirements for data that you don't have, that might come from the outside, or that is coming from the inside and you haven't collected yet. So that gap analysis should be part of each data strategy as well.
Do we have any questions?
We do indeed. So we've got a couple there, and I'll just remind our audience, both here and virtually, that you can use the Q&A feature for additional questions. So this question is how to maintain credibility and avoid greenwashing accusations, as some of the external third party is often opaque and divergent.
I can take it. The question is about greenwashing, and I think this is a big terminology in the ESG framework, even outside of data, right? Talking about ESG in particular. So some of the metrics that I was talking about, right, as we were going through, how do we make sure our data is green? I think that's an important perspective that we have to supply. If I am the supplier of third-party data to another institution, I'll start with me being the producer of the data. I think the producers have to take this into account. How do I make sure that somebody who consumes my data can look at certain metrics that I ship along with my data to gain the trust that I am not greenwashing the data? And this goes back to my own reporting capabilities, which I can set up to say, this is how much energy footprint we are taking from our data centers. Here are all the measures we have taken in order to be responsible with our data. Here are the number of deletion requests that have come from the customers, and this is the SLA with which we have responded to those deletions. Also responding to saying, because of the deletion, here are all the 5 other steps we have taken in order to make sure that the deletion is taken care downstream. Whatever those things are, right? Those metrics are not defined today in the industry. If we can come up with our own definition to start with before the standardization start to kick in, now I can say, when I am the producer of the data, my data, when it leaves the premises, it goes with a scorecard that tells the person downstream, this is how green my data is. Now, I would say, if I'm the consumer, I would love to enforce some of these things on my third parties from where I'm receiving the data. I know a lot of them won't be able to satisfy that at the first go, but the more we ask from the consumer, from the producers, I think we should be able to say, this will be an evolutionary cycle through which we potentially protect ourselves from greenwashing of the data, which I don't think is never going to be a done deal. There's always going to be some problems that we will face, but how do we minimize that? By asking for more evidence from the producers rather than not. So,
yeah, and during renegotiation for data subscriptions that you're purchasing and that your organization is consuming, that contractual process, I think there's going to be an elevated indicator for, what are you doing? What is the service level agreement for this data that I'm consuming from you? And what are your ESG, what is protected? What are your processes? Yes. And that consistency of who you're interacting with, whether it is a SaaS provider, platform as a service, there is a whole ecosystem for the software and the services that you're using around your data. So I think ESG is going to be a very important period, the additional part of a vetting process as you engage with vendors and partners as well.
So if you have a question in the audience, you can go ahead and use the mic.
Oh, hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Harish Arora. I think when you look at the credit rating agencies like Moody's and S&P and the correlation between the credit rating that they provide or the FICO scores agencies, the divergence of the score is pretty limited, right in the range of 10 basis points. But when you compare that with the ESG indices or the ratings that are provided by the companies like MSCI Sustainalytics, the divergence is as high as about 60 basis points. Would love to hear your perspective on applying AI and machine learning in reducing that divergence to essentially develop more trust in those indices, in those ratings, if anything around that has been done.
Great question, and one of my customers is doing it as part of their ESG reporting, is exactly to your point and absolutely spot on, right? And I think we were covering it early on. There are very few standards in reporting. I mean, there are few, but there are very few standards that are there out in reporting. And even when they report out, I don't know what models they're using to report out. Whereas in your credit agencies, there has been oversight on the credit agencies over the last 20 years. And they are coming from a financial services background where model risk management has been a principled approach for at least like 30, 40 years now, right? That kind of a principle is not there yet in the ESG reporting pipeline. So my producers of the ESG data, I don't even know what model risks managements they are following or whether their models are even like governed in a way that they can be, they're all self-governed at this moment. Bare minimum, I would ask for my data producer to at least give me a due diligence report on my data. How did you produce this? Give me some kind of a, if I take a software engineering principle, was there like some sort of a code review that was done? Was the model reviewed in order to produce this data? Those things are not there in the industry yet. So the consumers of the data are using the AI models, the ones that you were talking about, in order to come up with a number, given that they've gotten all these variances. But I think that's fixing the problem further on than earlier in the life cycle. At least that's my experience in the industry so far.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
Because I think, so you ask about the ratings, and that's more or less would probably standardize its way. And then we talked about transparency in AI, the explainability, ethics of AI. The other thing is, what I mentioned earlier, the activist investors, they might not care about certain metrics or certain standards that have been established. Perception sometimes becomes reality, and if the mood swings one way or another, so even if it's not part of your official reporting and you're using some models to make decisions, you might still have to explain, even though it might not be part of your official reporting. So take that into consideration as well.
So we do have another question. This is quite an interesting one, so it's a bit of a long one. So the entire concept of ESG is dependent upon who the defining organization or regulatory authority is. What happens when the morals and ethics of the regulatory authority are in contrast to the business internal morals and ethics? All of the discussions around ESG presume the moral and ethics of the government body are correct. What happens when they aren't?
Very interesting.
Good question.
It's a philosophical question.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
I guess maybe because we have people from Europe here, between Europe and US, there is a philosophical difference between the way we think about ESG. So, I mean, that's a hard one. I think whoever asked that question knew about the complexity of it. So, I don't know, Danielle or Martin, if you guys have.
I mean, I would say so there's part of the corporate identity. Your organization has a certain culture, certain values, certain ethics that they stand for, and that builds how your employees behave, who you are to your customers in the market. Obviously, that potentially could clash with what the requirements are, what the political requirements are, what the stream developments are in politics. So it's a tough one. I think you do want to be true to your organization and to your cultural values, but you have to navigate and make sure you're in compliance. So, I mean, that's a tough one.
I think also it would be shaped by client expectations, right? So when people shop today, they're accustomed to a certain experience, and that's elevated the way in which other organizations have a customer experience. So I think in this topic, if there was a big gap between an organization and a regulatory body, I think there would be a public opinion and a customer experience around, is this not protected enough? Is this, are we vulnerable by not addressing ESG in a certain way? I think it would raise, public awareness, and that would be a different dimension of customer experience and expectation around metrics. And you would see that in organizations. And there are bodies where, people are coming together to do, like the EDM Council, what are the standards for how we do data management? What are the standards for how we do, cloud? And I think this itself will also have a community around those types of topics. And I would see those people, regardless of the organization that they're in, maybe that would bring to the surface the disparity. Well, what side are we on, and how would that be resolved? And perhaps that would bubble up to a regulatory conversation.
Great. Just in the last minute, one last question. How can financial institutions support or be more engaging on ESG?
My immediate reaction is that financial institutions have been under the regulatory lens for a long time compared to the rest of the other industries. We do have regulations on other sides, but financial services has been working with regulators for a long time with a lot of different principled approach in processes, model risk management being one of them, data risk being another one. Maybe there are learnings that we can take from that and apply to ESG, then it becomes a more, it's a simplified process then, rather than reinventing the wheel. But we do have to reinvent ourselves because ESG is a new ask. So.
And I think maybe even participating in more business value assessments, right? So bringing that financial lens to maybe groups that are consuming data or going to be producing reporting and analytics for ESG, and sharing the formulation of using quantitative data instead of qualitative, because I do think a lot of organizations tend to go the qualitative route because they simply don't have the financial acumen, that maybe the rigor that's been applied to a CFO type role. So that's kind of an upskilling in that context.
Excellent. Martin, any last words?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. Well, listen, Danielle, Martin, Sreekar, on behalf of the Symposium, thank you very much indeed. KPMG, ladies, KPMG. You can go ahead and run the video bump out.